activist group. We're a political group, but we do work on the ground. Some of you have been with us in rebuilding activities. In other words, we're political in that we're interested in ending this whole situation. And we use activism as a vehicle towards that end. And in particular, the issue of house demolitions. This is one of the most painful parts of Israeli oppression. You know, in the occupied territory alone, Israel has demolished about 55,000 Palestinian homes since 1967. And what I hasten to add, because you know the knee-jerk reaction is, well, these must have been homes of terrorists. Why else would Israel demolish? So, you know, Israel has succeeded in getting this terrorist security framing to be automatically the way the lens through which we interpret things. And that's where the house demolition issue is so powerful in terms of advocacy, reframing. Because in fact, a full, and I'm not exaggerating, 99% of the homes demolished in the occupied territory, of the 55,000 homes and counting, only 99% were demolished with no connection whatsoever to security or terrorism or anything like that. It had nothing to do with that. It is simply a proactive policy of denying homes for Palestinians and inducing emigration and displacing them from their lands. So Israel has frozen the construction of new Palestinian homes in 1967, more than 50 years ago. Well, you have kids, and your kids have kids, and you need somewhere to live, which is a fundamental human right, of course, so that in the end you're forced to build a home on land you own, for the most part. This isn't invading public lands. There's nothing political behind it. Simply to build a modest home for your family on land you own, and your home is demolished. So Israel has demolished 55,000 homes in the occupied territory. But one of the things that house demolitions teaches us is that there really isn't that much of a difference between the occupation and Israel itself. This is a dichotomy that I think we have to, we'll talk about this now, this is a dichotomy I think we have to move beyond. The assumption being that the occupation is a problem, we have to end the occupation, but Israel itself is fine. You know? Well, first of all, in 1948, I have to say, that house demolitions began as a policy by the British. So you guys invented that in Palestine before 1948, you know, during the Mandate period. And only Palestinian homes were demolished, not the homes of Jews during the Mandate period. Although it wasn't anything on this scale, of course. In 1948, in the Nakba, in the catastrophe of 1948, Israel demolished about 60,000 Palestinian homes. More than 530 entire villages, towns, and urban areas were systematically demolished so that the residents couldn't return, the refugees, and that Israel could take the lands and the properties. But that's not the end of the story. Inside Israel itself, this non-problematic Israel proper, within the Green Line, since 1948 until today, another tens of thousands, we don't know exactly how many because we can't get the figures from the government, but tens of thousands of additional homes of Palestinians have been demolished. There's one famous Bedouin community of El Araqib that many of you know that's been demolished more than 120 times in the Negev in order to make way for a military settlement. In other words, the whole idea of displacing Palestinians, taking their lands and replacing them with Israeli settlers is not only done in the occupied territory. It's still done in Israel. You know, the Israeli Jews are a minority in the Galilee, in the north, for example. So there's a whole process of Judaization of the entire country that's still going on, of which house demolitions plays a key role. So we focus on the issue of house demolitions, both in solidarity, of course, with the Palestinians. We also raise funds, like tonight, for example, that give us the resources to rebuild homes. We've built about 200 homes since the last 20 years. Now you might say, well, what's 200 homes out of 55,000 in the occupied territory? Well, if this was humanitarian, good Israelis building homes for these poor Palestinian victims, first of all, it would be meaningless. And second of all, the Palestinians would never cooperate with us, because that's not the framing that they would accept, that we would even offer. This is joint acts. You think about it as 200 joint acts of political resistance on the part of Israelis and Palestinians and internationals to come to join us, like some of you. That becomes a meaningful form of resistance. But in addition to that, with house demolitions, it lets us understand Israeli intentions. What does Israel want, whether it's inside Israel or in the occupied territory? Because obviously house demolitions is a part of an ethnic cleansing strategy of displacing tens of thousands of people. So the message is, if you can't have a home as an individual family, collectively, you have no place in this country. Get out. Get out is basically the answer. So that as we know then, and then we can, from our knowledge of what's happening on the ground, that I think is where the authority of our analysis of what we're saying comes from. We've been there. We know the reality on the ground. We then trace out the threads of what has to be done. Well, what becomes obvious, and all of you know this, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know, the two-state solution that your government supports is gone. It's over. And it's been over for 20 years now. I mean, anybody that knows the reality on the ground, the fragmenting of the Palestinian territories, the building of more than 200 settlements, about 800,000 Israelis that live in the Palestinian territory, and this new government of Netanyahu is promising another 2 million settlers within the next 4 or 5 years. The annexation of Jerusalem, the whole highway system that links the settlements into Israel proper, and again fragments Palestinian territory, their loss of water, their loss of the airspace, the communication sphere. In other words, the occupation is on the ground, under the ground, and over the ground. And it's complete. So that we know then that the two-state solution is gone. I would argue that it never was. And this leads us into another kind of a discussion that I think is important. Because what we want to do ultimately is to get out of this mess, is to find a way out of this. Well, to do that, and this is where our work on the ground has helped us, we have to correctly analyze what the problem is, what the situation is. And we've all been using a wrong language and a wrong framing all these years. All of us, including me, until recently when with Palestinian partners, we have a group that's called the One Democratic State Campaign. For the last couple of years, Palestinians and Israelis have been sitting down to try to formulate a one-state, which is, I'll talk about in a second, a one-state solution, But in order to do that, we've had to really reframe and reconceptualize how we see this conflict. And that was the first problem. We call it a conflict. But it's not a conflict. We're misnaming the very thing. A conflict is between two sides, right? Or more, but at least two sides that disagree about something. Maybe they fight about something. So the way you resolve a conflict is you bring the sides together. They negotiate, they compromise, and they come up with some kind of a solution. That's how you approach a conflict. But there's no sides here. Because Zionism, and we've got to go back to Zionism, which is still the impelling drive behind Israeli policy, Zionism was a settler colonial movement. What? Settler colonial movement. In other words, it had a nationalistic framework to it. Jews felt that they had a genuine tie to the country, that's true. But the form they took of reestablishing or the contact, their national connection to the country, took the form of settler colonialism. Not traditional colonialism. I mean, you guys are the champion colonists. No one's ever gonna challenge you. But when you conquered India, the idea wasn't to settle India, to annex India to Britain. Classic colonialism was extractive. You took out resources, you took out labor, you had trade things. You used India, in a sense. Settler colonialism is different. Settler colonialism is when settlers come to a country in order to take it over. They're not coming to immigrate. They're not coming to integrate into the country. They're coming to take it over. And that's clear that was and is the ultimate goal of Zionism. And it's not a secret. I mean, the Zionists from Ben-Gurion to Netanyahu have all declared openly that this is what we want to do. And so it's a unilateral process. It has nothing to do with Arabs. And I say Arabs because in Israel we don't use the word Palestinian. Because if the country belongs to us, and there is no other people there, then this whole famous Zionist phrase that it's a country without a people, it didn't mean there were no people there. They didn't mean that they didn't know there were Arabs in the country. What it meant was the Arabs in the country did not add up to a collective, a nation, a people that had national rights. They were a bunch of natives. And natives in settler colonialism are simply obstacles. You displace them, you drive them out, you confine them maybe to ghettos or Bantustans, or you eliminate them. Those are the pretty stark options. You do not integrate them, you don't negotiate with them, they have no rights, they're not a side. I would argue that despite Oslo, there has never, ever, ever really been negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. Israel has never recognized the existence of a Palestinian people. In Oslo, all it did, and Oslo was like the peak of all this hope and political process and everything else, all Israel did in Oslo was to recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner. That's it. It didn't recognize the Palestinian people, its national rights, and it did not accept a two-state solution. And so Zionism then is a unilateral movement that's exclusive. It has an exclusive title to the country. And this is what settler colonialism does. Settlers make up a story about why the country belongs to them. After all, you've got to justify it, Why am I entitled to take this country and Hisham and the indigenous population have no rights and can actually be displaced, and if they resist, they're criminalized. You see, that's the strength of the terrorism idea, is that because they're not another side, because they don't have legitimate rights, when they resist, they're resisting like criminals. That's the way you frame it. So what gives me that right? What gives me that entitlement to their country? What makes their country my country? And that's a story. Every settler colonial movement makes up a story about why the land belongs to them. Usually the story has to do with God somewhere. God gave us the land, God chose us, God doesn't like these native people. South Africa was like that, the United States is like that. Certainly Israel and Zionism was like that. Sometimes the story has to do with civilizing the savages. That was France's main story. Whatever it is, settler colonials make up a story that justifies their exclusive entitlement to the country. So that it's unilateral, it's exclusive, and the natives, the Palestinians, have nothing to do with it. They're irrelevant. They might be foils, but they really have no role to play, and they're completely superfluous to our national story. And therefore, not only is the two-state solution, not only was it never in the cards, but the whole idea of occupation is the wrong word. Now there is an occupation in international law. The Fourth Geneva Convention applies. The International Court of Justice in The Hague affirmed that there's an occupation. That's been affirmed by the UN and so on. But international law, I'm sorry to say, plays no role whatsoever. It's academic. It's absolutely irrelevant in power politics, in international politics. What does play the role, who calls the cards, is Israel and Zionism. Zionism in this case has 1,000,000 times more influence in actual international politics than all the corpus of international law that no one can ever enforce. It's nice international law and human rights, and it's very nice to talk about rights-based approaches, but it means nothing. So that we have to really interpret this and fight it according to the way Zionism has framed it, in a sense, and reframe that. That means then that there is no occupation. Israel formally, officially denies that there is an occupation. And that's why it doesn't apply the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's a signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention that protects peoples living under occupation. But Israel says it simply doesn't apply because this is our country. You can't occupy your own country, right? And so what I'm saying is the whole concept of occupation distorts the situation, because occupation assumes a territory that's somehow outside of your country, right? It's outside, it has a kind of a neutral or ambivalent status. You have to negotiate it, decide what to do with it. It can be detached and made into another country, maybe. That's not the way Israel looks at the West Bank. We don't even call it the West Bank. We call it Judea and Samaria. And it's the heart of the land of Israel. It isn't some marginal piece on the side that doesn't belong to us that we can negotiate away. That's not the way it's seen. And in fact, if I would leave you with one term tonight to remember, that kind of captures what I'm trying to say, is the term Judaization. It's not a term we use very often, And in fact, it's a term that non-Jews are a little bit uneasy about, because it has a vague hint of anti-Semitic something, Judaization, but it's an official term that's been used by the Zionist movement for the last 125 years, and it's used officially by Israel. Our policy officially, it's written down, is to Judaize the Galilee, to Judaize Jerusalem, Yehud Yerushalayim, Yehud Galil. I mean, it's a common phrase even. So overall, writ large, the whole thrust then of Zionism is to Judaize the country, to turn an Arab country into a Jewish country, to turn Palestine into the land of Israel. And I would argue, and I don't think many people can disagree with me, especially if you look at the map, that it's been done. Not only is the two-state solution gone, eliminated by Israel, and this is another important part of the reframing. You know, Israel gets away with it because Israel casts itself as the victim. So it's always, it's always the victim of terrorism, victim of security. What about, the Jews are the ultimate victims. Palestinians can't trump us in that department. And so that's really what allows Israel to, I think, to get away with this. So the reframing has to be, and I wrote a book that came out a couple years ago called War Against the People, which tries to show how powerful Israel is, economically, militarily, politically. It's not the victim, it's the strong party, by far. So the reframing is that it's Israel that eliminated the two-state solution. In other words, we have to hold Israel accountable. And of course, the strength, the power of being a victim is that you can't hold the victim accountable. That's where Israel wins. Because Israel can be the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. It can be an occupying power, but we're the victims. And so you can't hold us accountable for what's happening. We're simply defending ourselves. And then security gets thrown into the pot, and terrorism, and we're home free. So what we have to do is reframe and say, no, Israel is a strong party, and not only that, but because it's a settler colonial entity, it has proactively eliminated the two-state solution deliberately, consciously over 50 years. Okay, if that's the case, that the two-state solution is gone, and I would suggest at least 20 years it's gone, that means then that Israel has created one state already. There is already one functioning state. This whole argument, two states or one state, is gone. It's over a long time ago. Because the country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is functionally one state system. You can't get into this country from any direction without going through Israeli border controls. There's one army, obviously. There's one governing authority. And don't tell me the Palestinian Authority is an effective government. There's one infrastructure. Excuse me. There's one infrastructure. There's one electrical system. There's one water system. There's one currency. In other words, by any measure, it is one functioning country. But it's an apartheid country. And I'm not saying that as a slogan, apartheid. It conforms to the law against apartheid, which means that there's one governing authority, but there's separate legal systems for different populations. That's apartheid. So that you have one legal system, actually you have three major legal systems. You really have more because there's religious ones as well, but leaving that aside, You've got one legal system for Israeli Jewish citizens, and that has been reaffirmed by the Jewish nationalities law that was passed a couple months ago by the Knesset. You have another set of laws for Palestinian or non-Jewish, let's say, citizens of Israel. For example, non-Jewish citizens of Israel who are not Jewish, are forbidden to live on 94% of the country, of the land of Israel. You know, they live under another set of laws, and of course, Hisham, Palestinian non-citizens of Israel, in the occupied territory, live certainly under another set of laws. You saw that when Hisham was saying how the soldiers have no jurisdiction over settler civilians. That's apartheid. And it goes on and on, of course. Apartheid is also separation. And you can see where Israel is going in terms of a Bantustan. Of creating this kind of a Bantustan, Israel and Trump, I might say, this kind of a Bantustan that is an apartheid system. So, if then we agree, maybe we don't all agree, but it's hard not to make this case, that the two-state solution is gone. I know there's people that still cling to it, including Palestinians, like the PA. But it's very hard to argue it's a real thing. And assuming that we all agree that apartheid is unacceptable, it seems to me, at least, that the alternative is almost mathematical. I mean, I can't see a fourth option. It means that our task is crystal clear. And that is to transform the one apartheid state that Israel has already created into a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens. Period. Now, in order to, so in other words, that conclusion isn't just a conclusion that pops up. It's a logical conclusion of a political analysis that makes sense. So you can continue that analysis. Now the question is, okay, how would this thing work? You know, because that's what a lot of Israelis and Palestinians and others say. It's a nice idea, but it could never work. They could never live together, they hate each other, all that kind of stuff. So we've developed the One Democratic State campaign, a 10-point program. You have it, some of you have it at least, it was on the table. A 10-point program that really begins to block out, it's not the final word, but it begins to block out an effective approach to the major issues that confront us. And let me just talk about 4 of the 10, briefly, or fairly briefly. First of all, we're talking about a constitutional democracy. Israel is the only country in the world, except some other country, I can't remember which one, that doesn't have a constitution.
Magna Carta.
So at least you have a Magna Carta. We don't have a constitution. And that's why we can make all these crazy laws, because there's no checks and balances. And now, you know, in the next couple months, pay attention, the Netanyahu government is going to completely neutralize the Supreme Court in Israel. They're going to pass a law. First of all, the Supreme Court justices are appointed by the parliament. And second of all, which is Likud. And second of all, or Likud are the religious. And second of all, that the Supreme Court cannot overrule laws passed by the parliament. So there's no checks or balances anymore in the system. So that can't be, of course. You have to have a constitution, and the revolution in our system is to move from a country based on an ethnic, national, religious basis, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Palestinians, Israel, all these ethno-national religious bases, to a country based on an equal citizenship. Simply citizenship, like you have in the UK. A Western democracy, a liberal democracy you might call it. That's the first piece. The second is the right of return. You're not going anywhere without the absolute right of return of refugees to the country. And it makes sense. It isn't only a right. Refugees have a right to return home. But it makes sense in terms of our model. Because if you're talking about a state that's based on a citizenry, well, refugees are a part of your citizenry. Just because a refugee flees a country, and refugees have a right to flee a conflict area. Just because you flee a country or you're driven out of a country doesn't mean you lose your civil status, you and your descendants. So that in a sense, the right of return embodies an ingathering, a coming home of all the citizens of the country that want to come back. And of course there'll be land redistribution. I mean, this is the simple way of putting it. I'm not getting into details, and we have to flesh it out. You know, financial compensations. I mean, there's a lot of things we have to do to reintegrate that population into the country, but that's a key part of the program. Third, I don't have to too much get into this, individual rights. Absolute equal individual rights for everyone in the country. In other words, one citizenship, one parliament, one set of laws, period. That's it. But, and it's not really a but, it's an and. You know, in the UK, you have a right to different ethnic identities, religious identities, national identities, gender identities. You have all those rights here. It doesn't have to be said anywhere. It's become embodied in your system. If people have rights in a democracy, it's understood that you have also these collective rights. That you can be a Scottish, Muslim, whatever, you can be, you know, in other words, you can have whatever ethnic, national, gender, class identities you want. That's not taken for granted in our part of the world, because in our part of the world, of course, ethno-nationalism has meant that these fight all the time. You know, it's either or. The country belongs either to this group or to that. We don't even have a common name for the country. There's nothing overarching. So in a sense, what you have to do is create a common framework. I'll come to that in a second. But also, you have to reassure the people that their collective rights are also guaranteed. That they can remain Palestinian. You know, Palestinians have been fighting for their national identity for 100 years. You know, they want to keep that. For better or for worse, Israeli Jews are a national community. There's other groups in the country as well, including about 200,000 Russians who are citizens of Israel who are not Jewish, about 40,000 African asylum seekers who are now moving into the second generation in Israel. So there's other communities as well. So that the idea is, it's okay. You can keep your national, ethnic, religious, class, gender, whatever identities and associations within the framework of a multicultural democracy. So it's basically simply reaffirming what you have, you know, as an accepted right. But here we have to kind of reaffirm it. Partly because, you know, we have to anticipate in this plan the objections and the fears. Well, one of the fears, to be honest, is what's going to happen to the Israeli Jews who will be the minority in the country. They're already the minority, even before the return of refugees. What's going to happen to them? So basically, and this isn't only a question that Israeli Jews ask, I think it's something that affects whether or not we can get the international community to back our program or not. They're going to say, what about the Jews? I mean, it's sort of a normal question in some ways. And so we address that. The Israeli Jews can remain Israeli Jews to the degree they want to, or they can integrate into the country. And nobody's going to threaten them. But there's no privileges, there's no leverage. It doesn't cost anything. It's simply a safety net to assure people that their security, individual or collective, is guaranteed. And in a sense, really what our vision is, really what this would lead to, is a new civil society. In other words, if we break down these ethnic, national, religious lines, I mean, people, again, can remain within, I would assume the refugees come back. Well, the refugees have been refugees for 70 years. They're Palestinian, they want to come home as Palestinians, they suffered as Palestinians. They don't want to jump into a civil society. They have no idea what a civil society would mean. So they have that right to take a generation or two and be within their community and then see where they want to go with that. Ultra-Orthodox Jews are going to want to remain within their segregated communities. That's okay. I mean, you have Golders Green in London. I mean, you've got these kinds of communities. That's okay as long as you respect a multicultural democracy. But the thrust of what we want to do is more to create something new. So in the new generation, there'll be civil marriage. There'll be integrated schools, integrated workplaces, integrated neighborhoods. In other words, the thrust of the country is going to be people living together. And then they can decide to what degree they want to be ethnic or whatever, or to what degree they want to integrate with everyone else, just like in this country. So that a new civil society will emerge. That's really the hopeful and natural kind of a process that you're letting happen. Let me just give you one little example of what I mean. It's cute, but I think it's a good example. You know, in the FIFA standings, the World Football Association standings, the Palestinian national football team has a higher ranking than the Israeli national team. And but neither one has managed to get into the World Cup. And you know what a big deal that is. So can you imagine if we have this country and we have one team and we have our best players and we, the Palestinian, Israeli, Russian, African asylum seeker team gets into the World Cup? Can you imagine what that would mean in terms of rooting for the same team? That's exactly the kind of lived, shared life that'll generate a new society. And that's what I think that's the main thing that our program allows. It doesn't break down anything. It doesn't dismantle structures of domination, of course. But the idea isn't to destroy anything. The idea is to transform the country from what it is into a functioning multicultural democracy. So that's the vision I want to share with you. We have other pieces of it, economics and human rights and Middle East. I won't get into that tonight. But I think it's a vision, but it's not only a vision, it's a political program that we want to work on. Now, we're not there yet. This can't happen without Palestinian leadership. So we're working now to bring Palestinians on board. And the problem is, I'll be honest with you, the problem is today that most Palestinians know the two-state solution is gone. They accept the one-state solution. The one-state solution was accepted by the PLO 50, 60 years ago. That's not the issue. They don't believe it's possible. And you can understand them. They don't believe they can beat Israel, they can beat Trump, they can beat Europe. And so people are reluctant, as Hisham says, they're struggling, they're suffering, they're just surviving. They really don't have the mental space to think about collective rights in a shared civil society. So that's part of our task, is to convince at least a critical mass of Palestinians that this isn't utopian, and that this is a real political option, because we're all dependent, of course, on the Palestinians. We can't move ahead without their leadership and their direction. So that hopefully, we'll be able to jump. I'm not asking you for anything now, but I'm just telling you what's coming down the pipeline, because I think that will empower all of us. And I really do believe that if the Palestinians get behind this, with their critical Israeli allies, like us, and you, there's a worldwide movement for Palestine, that in fact this is a real political option, and the tipping point might be closer than what we expect. So that's kind of where we are right now, and we can talk about it. I think we have to take a leaf out of the page of South Africa. One of the things that's similar is that the ANC knew that the white population of South Africa was not going to be a partner. That they had to end apartheid without the cooperation of the white society. Now, there were certain, obviously, European figures that were very important for the ANC. It wasn't, but overall, you could say, obviously, the white European society was benefiting, enjoying apartheid, and it wasn't about to dismantle it. So the ANC had to take that into account, and they developed a strategy of working with the international civil society, in particular. Churches, a lot of you were involved, a lot of us were involved, churches, trade unions, university groups, activist groups, political groups, and really South Africa, and that changed government policy. Thatcher, as we all know, saw Mandela as a terrorist. And it was a change in public opinion that changed the British government. But not only that, South Africa, the ANC always had an end game. The end game was one person, one vote. So you always knew, in terms of how close we're getting to one person, one vote, where we stood in the struggle. And de Klerk offered Mandela all kinds of compromises. Three separate houses of parliament for the whites and the coloreds and the blacks, power sharing, and the ANC had one person, one vote as their end game. That's what we're lacking today, is an end game. We're in between. The two-state solution is gone. The one-state solution is still being formulated. It's still in its infancy. And you can't be in a political struggle without an end game. That's the problem. We have a worldwide movement, but it has no ask. What are we BDSing for? And you could say end the occupation, but you can kind of see that that's a pretty inadequate way of putting it. So that's what we need. And then with that, armed with an end game, we replicate in some ways what the ANC did. And that is that we know the Israeli Jewish community is not going to be a part of the solution. They're not going to cooperate. Why would they? They're living the good life. And so we have to, they have allies, like some of us, but overall that's not the case. So the Palestinians then have to create this alliance with you, with the international civil society, with a focus and a direction and a goal of an end game. And I think that would be very effective. And in fact, we're very far down that road. We don't have to start from scratch. I believe, from my travels, that Palestine has become a global issue at the level of the anti-apartheid struggle. The only thing that separates it from the anti-apartheid struggle is that lack of an end game. So people are kind of stuck. They don't know exactly what to tell their MPs. In terms of, we don't have a program that we're selling. If we have that, we can already build on the huge infrastructure that exists. And I think, create a very effective movement. And the fact that our program addresses the issue of the Jewish public. What's going to happen to the Jews? Are they going to be secure? What are their rights? That does two things. It allows people to wholeheartedly support our program because it isn't against anybody. It's not anti-Israel, it's not anti-Jewish, it's not, there's no victims here, but it's a win-win, inclusive kind of a solution. And that's important for people, including you, I think. And at the same time, what happened in South Africa was that already in 1955, the ANC issued its Freedom Charter that said, our vision of South Africa after apartheid is inclusive of everyone. We're all South Africans. And then that was embodied in the Constitution that they formulated before the end of apartheid. And that's what allowed the transition to happen. The whites didn't support it. That didn't convince anybody. But once de Klerk said it's over, they were able to make that transition, the whites, and the Afrikaners especially, because they saw that they were a part of the new society. That was very important, and I think it's true here. We're not going to convince Israelis to support the one-state solution by any means. But when we make it unsustainable, that's our job. When we make it when we make Israeli apartheid unsustainable, and it begins to collapse, that the Israeli Jewish public will be able to go along with the transition because they'll see that it's inclusive. So that's, I think, the answer. We're not building on the Israeli public. We're not going to convince them, but we can create a situation in which we can bypass them and in the end co-opt them, I think. Now I'm done with
questions. Ron.
Judith, I just was wondering.
Can you get up and shout?
Yeah, I was just wondering what Hisham thinks of the one-state solution and what people around you are saying about it in Hebron.
What I say is that I live there. I contact people every day. I have contact with the victims mainly every day, and I think that the Palestinians in this specific period, they are in a very bad situation. That they are so desperate and they are so exhausted to the point that they are looking to their daily life needs. And here I don't want to explain it a lot, a lot about what's going on in Gaza, for example. The West Bank, it seems, is going on the same way, actually. For the past 3 months, for example, public sector employees are receiving 50% of their salaries, and it's not going, we don't see an end of this. The settler colonial movement, the expansion of settlements and so on in Palestine is going on and on, and so people are facing all this. For the Palestinians these days, actually the talk about one-state solution or two-state solution or whatever looks a luxury, honestly. And in this case, I think that here our duty is to keep empowering the Palestinians. But when you talk about solutions, you talk about also kind of balance of power. And here, as the Palestinians are in this situation, are in the bottom, actually, so they don't talk about solutions. Okay, it's the responsibility of the leadership, and here this is another question. When we look at the current leadership, what leadership we have in Palestine? We have a dispute between the greatest factions in Palestine. We have Hamas controlling Gaza, Palestinian Authority led by Fatah in the West Bank, and the other smaller parties either with this or with that. And instead of building a strategy together and putting efforts together to push the Palestinian cause forward, they are keeping in, media campaigns against each other. And while the land is stolen every day, while people are facing gradual genocide in Gaza, and so that makes people so frustrated. Like, they put resources against each other. Like, we have TV stations, social media, spokespeople from both sides. They talk 20% against the Israelis and 80% about the other Palestinians. So with this kind of environment, that it's very difficult to rise up and call for a bad solution or a good one. Now, what makes, people are more interested in their daily life needs. They want to feed their children. They want to have, in Gaza, they have 4 hours, 6 hours of electricity per day. They have polluted water. So that's what they face. So in order to go to in a level to talk about a solution, we need to keep empowering the Palestinians, and that's one side. The Palestinians in the bottom, the people, and then I know that many of you represent organizations here, Palestine Solidarity Movement, Care of, Palestine, or you have. So it's good to convey these messages to the Palestinians, especially the decision makers there, and keep telling them or asking them questions about, such practices and, what's going on in Palestine, and to try to push them at least to be together. Now, in the moment, I believe that we need to mainly support groups that work on the ground, mainly on the resistance part. Although there is no political program there, we don't see it, but that will empower the Palestinians mostly. Of course, it's very important. It's good if somebody can donate here, a medical device for a hospital or for a Palestinian NGO that works on the health sector. Of course, I would not say that you stop it, but also the most important, that we keep the resistance alive. And very briefly, lately, a friend of mine, he wrote a small post in Facebook. He said, writing, "Oh God, when are we going to reach the bottom?"
Yeah.
So we start going up again, because he feels that we are going from bad to worse, and that's what most of the Palestinians feel. So they still feel that they are not even standing on a solid ground to start making a progress. So that's what I believe about.